Some people think that all OLED TVs within the same model year will use the same OLED panel, but that's simply not true at all. Here, on your left is a 48-inch LG C2, and on your right is a 65-inch Sony A80K. If we display a peak white window at full blast in HDR for 10 seconds, then switch to a full-field gray slide, you can see the rectangular afterglow lingering longer on the Sony A80K, whereas the LG C2 cleared away image retention in a quicker manner, even though both OLEDs are not equipped with an additional heatsink, since they are not flagship models from either company. Shining a light onto both screens would reveal another difference. The anti-glare coating on the Sony A80K appeared matte with a diffuse magenta tint when hit by light, while the glossy finish on the LG C2 was more reflective but also maintained higher contrast in a brighter environment. After calibrating the Sony A80K to D65 white point, peak brightness measured 620 nits on a 10% window and 130 nits full field, which is similar to last year's Bravia A80J despite using the more resilient WBE OLED panel from LG Display. Because of Sony's conservative approach, the A80K lagged behind other mid-range OLEDs such as the LG C2, the Panasonic LZ series, and the Philips 807 in terms of HDR peak brightness. While Sony's always active dynamic tone mapping could compensate somewhat to maintain APL or average picture level in most HDR scenes, the lower headroom meant that there's more highlight compression to the extent that some bright detail had a tendency to look clipped. Where the Sony A80K shone was in picture processing thanks to its Bravia XR engine. 10-bit gradation was top-notch, presenting the smoothest gradients among 2022 OLED televisions even without needing to engage its smooth gradation decontouring filter. Upscaling was similarly excellent, with this SMPTE RP133 test card in 576i appearing clean and detailed without excessive noise and fizziness, which boded well for standard definition and high-definition real-world content. Although we prefer the way motion settings are separated into low frame rate and high frame rate interpolation on competing OLEDs from other manufacturers, there's no doubting the polished algorithm of Sony's motion processing. Even with motion flow disabled, the Bravia A80K correctly performed 4:4 pull-down to present 24 frames per second movies accurately without telescenic judder. If you are one of those who are sensitive to the mild stutter inherent in 24p films, which is laid bare by OLED's near-instantaneous pixel response time, you can bump smoothness to 1 to make panning shots appear more fluid without introducing significant soap opera effect or interpolation artifacts. Note that because the internal TV apps operate at 60Hz on Sony TVs, Motion Flow Custom and Film Mode High are necessary to extract 24p cadence from Netflix or Disney Plus programs. Otherwise, there would be noticeable telescenic judder in slow panning shots. Near black luminance tracking came closer than the flagship Sony A95K QD OLED to matching that on a Sony BVM HSAC 310 reference monitor. But there remain two issues common to WRGB OLED TVs from the Japanese manufacturer. 1. There is a sharp transition when coming out from black, causing a distinct stripe of posterization at certain tones. And 2. There would be near black overshoot when the white subpixels start being activated above a specific threshold, manifesting as flashing artifacts in some dark scenes, particularly if the content is heavily compressed with a low bitrate. Bright uniformity on our 65-inch Sony A80K review sample was superb, with no dirty screen effect or banding on full-field gray slides, and only some mild pink tinting along the sides, primarily on the left, owing to the WBE panel. Like all other 2022 OLED TVs we've tested, the Sony A80K did not exhibit any faint horizontal lines or what we call the Venetian blind effect on bright elements in HDR content. Otherwise, SDR color accuracy was outstanding after calibration, with an average delta error of below 1 on this challenging color checker SG chart where 140 patches were measured, and no inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3, translating to cinematic colors in real-world viewing. Talking of which, I would like to tell you about the calibration service offered by UK electrical retailer Cranbrook Moore, who have kindly sponsored this video. I have personally trained their calibrator David Connor to my own high standards. For an extra fee, he will run in a TV you buy from them, calibrate it, and deliver it to you after having the calibration approved by me. We've been doing this for more than a year, and customer feedback has been excellent. So please give Cranbrook Moore a call if you wish to buy a calibrated television, or even any new TV at a competitive price with excellent customer service. Thanks again for your support. Okay, for HDR, DCI P3 color gamut coverage reached more than 99% in UV terms, whereas Rec 2020 coverage was 78%. With game mode engaged, input lag measured 16 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, halving to 8 milliseconds at 120 frames per second. Due to the MediaTek MT5895 chipset, only 2 out of the 4 HDMI connections are HDMI 2.1 inputs, of which one is the eARC port. Both HDMI 2.1 ports carry the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, but only if you forego Dolby Vision support. Note that Sony still requires users to go into the HDMI signal format submenu on the TV and manually select Enhanced Format VRR for one of these 2 HDMI 2.1 ports to enable 4K 120Hz VRR, which is less intuitive than how other TV manufacturers have implemented their advanced gaming features. Engaging VRR would lock the Sony A80K into VRR game mode and increase the input lag to 21 milliseconds and 17 milliseconds at 60 fps and 120 fps respectively, according to our Leo Bodnar tester. Courtesy of the companion chip inside the Bravia XR processor, the Sony A80K was still able to extract full 4K 120Hz resolution from the MediaTek MT5895 SoC, though sadly not full 444 chroma reproduction in VRR mode. Like on all Bravia XR TVs, the adjust HDR settings on the PS5 would be auto-populated upon first handshake with the Sony A80K, but unfortunately the result was suboptimal, leading to a washed-out HDR presentation with blown-out highlights in HDRG-compliant games. Since setting HDR tone mapping to off undertracked the HDR10 PQ EOTF standard, and there's always on dynamic tone mapping otherwise, the best workaround we found was to disable HDR tone mapping on the television, then set the first and second adjust HDR screens on the PS5 until the sun first disappeared, which should take around 15 or 16 clicks from the bottom. As always, the third screen should be adjusted all the way down to black. When playing HDR games, you should then switch HDR tone mapping to gradation preferred to restore accurate PQ EOTF tracking. VRR worked well to reduce tearing and frame drops, although some VRR flicker was unavoidable in certain games containing more sedate scenes and static menus. After running the acoustic auto-calibration function, which measures your listening environment using the remote control microphone, audio quality on the Sony 65 A80K was very good by TV standards, delivering decent bass, dialogue clarity, and in particular, precise sound localization from the Acoustic Surface Audio Plus technology, where sound is emitted from the OLED screen itself. Let's sum up. The Sony A80K is a solid OLED TV which features class-leading native gradation, excellent upscaling, strong motion handling, accurate colors after calibration, and impressive sound quality, on top of OLED's true blacks and wide viewing angles, and so it earns our recommended award. However, compared to mid-range OLED TVs from rival brands, the Bravia A80K suffers from slightly higher input lag in VRR mode, more image retention, and lower peak brightness when displaying HDR content. Now, some of you may think that a peak brightness of 620 nits on the Sony A80K is already bright enough, and you don't need a brighter OLED TV, in which case you have to watch this video where I demonstrate why your OLED TV isn't bright enough.